Welcome to You Are Not a Frog, life hacks for doctors and busy professionals who want to beat burnout and work happier. I'm Dr. Rachel Morris. I'm a GP, turned coach, speaker and specialist in teaching resilience, and I'm interested in how we can wake up and be excited about going to work no matter what. I've had 20 years experience of working in the NHS, both on the front line and teaching leadership and resilience. I know what it's like to feel overwhelmed, worried about making a mistake, and one crisis away from not coping. 2021 promises to be a particularly challenging year. Even before the coronavirus crisis, we were facing unprecedented levels of burnout. We have been compared to frogs in a pan of slowly boiling water, working harder and longer, and the heat has been turned up so slowly that we hardly notice the extra long days becoming the norm, and have got used to the low-grade feelings of stress and exhaustion. Let's face it, frogs generally only have two choices: stay in the pan and be boiled alive, or jump out of the pan and leave. But you are not a frog, and that's where this podcast comes in. You have many more options than you think you do. It is possible to be master of your own destiny and to craft your work and life so that you can thrive, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Through training as an executive and team coach, I discovered some hugely helpful resilience and productivity tools that transformed the way I approached my work. I've been teaching these principles over the last few years as the Shapes Toolkit programme, because if you're happier at work, you'll simply do a better job. In this podcast, I'll be inviting you inside the minds of friends, colleagues and experts, all who have an interesting take on this, so that together we can take back control to thrive, not just survive in our work and our lives, and love what we do again. So it's fantastic to have with me on the podcast today Dr. Katya Miles. Now, Katya is otherwise known as the Working Well Doctor, and she's a GP and occupational health doctor turned wellbeing trainer and careers coach. Wow, so that's quite a big portfolio, Katya.
Thank you. I hadn't thought of it that way before. Yes, I guess it's enough to keep me out of trouble, which is the general idea.
Out of trouble and working well, hopefully. And I can imagine that actually how to work well is something that we're all wondering right now.
I think it's helpful to think about the process of how we work, including how we're working at the moment, mainly from home or virtually. Some of us are at work, like GPs or clinic hospital doctors are often at work, but often a lot of their consultations are done virtually now.
So actually we're working virtually, even if we are at work. So we're actually working virtually, whether we're on the front line or whether we're at home. And I think it's interesting what you say, this thing about we need to think about how to do it, because I think before COVID, a lot of us weren't really thinking about how we're working. And I have had lots of chats with people fairly close to me saying, why can't you work from home 1 or 2 days a week? Or why can't you do this or that? And the answer's always come back, couldn't possibly, because we've got clients and we've got this and that. And actually, they've now found out that, we possibly can. And it's actually worked out. And so they've gone from no way, never, because this is the way we've always done it, to, now what is a possibility and what can be helpful. But of course, like you said, there's good things and there's bad things. And what we don't want to do is throw the baby out with the bathwater and it become all virtual, because that's a bit of a nightmare. But neither will we go back to, I think, all completely face-to-face like we used to.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think lots of workplaces, and definitely those outside healthcare as well, are thinking that what's the longer term model going to be? There's obviously a cost benefit for both workers and employers to having some people working from home. And of course, there's ecological benefits, less emissions and all that. And, personal, in your personal pocket as well, obviously maybe if you're traveling less to work, that's helpful. So there are some benefits. It's interesting, again, talking about benefits and culture change. So, when I was working in occupational health before the pandemic, working from home was something, or working virtually was something we would recommend as an adjustment. But sometimes it did have to be recommended as a reasonable adjustment by an actual doctor, for, like you said, for the manager, for the employer to take it on board. And then some adjustments and some planning had to be put in place, whether it's, having an internet connection at home or whatever. And often we would recommend it for people who had limited mobility, and it was difficult for them to get into work and so forth. And I think obviously people with caring responsibilities for a long time have try to do some flexible working or home working, because it gives you that flexibility. So as long as it's planned, you can in theory work at hours that are different from your standard 9 to 5. I think that's one of the other advantages of working from home. If you set it up and there's a task to be done, but you can do it in your own time and fit it around other commitments, whether they're childcare commitments or homeschooling, which we're just hopefully coming to the end of now.
Fingers crossed. Fingers and toes crossed.
Exactly. Hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, everyone will be back at school. But yeah, no, those are good examples of even pre-pandemic of when home working or flexible working was considered. But it was a big, like you said, it felt like a big deal quite often, not always, but quite often to arrange. And I think you're right now, in my view, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is exactly what you said, that there's now a culture shift where it's not seen as a big deal, that it's now people have done it, and managers and processes and clients who interact with workers are much more understanding, and they understand people are at home, and there might be a few slight changes, but ultimately, as long as the work gets done, I think that can be a positive situation.
I think possibly what has happened is that actually employers don't often know how to advise people properly about working at home. They've got all the health and safety stuff about what to do in the workplace, but actually how are you going to advise people when everyone's setup is completely different, and you know, everyone's lifestyle is completely different, and everyone's challenges are completely different depending on the age of your family, or if you live on your own, or if you're a carer, all those sorts of things. So I think one of the reasons why I wanted to get you to talk is I know you're a real expert in this, and I know you've written an article called 8 Tips for working from home, and I wanted to be able to share this with the listeners, because I think they're really, really important, and a lot of it is what I talk about in terms of resilience as well. But I do think we need to be thinking about how we do this virtually, because it is different, isn't it? What are the main differences that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think flexibility we've touched on, that's one of, I guess you might call the key advantages. But again, it needs to be managed, because almost the corollary of flexibility is blurring of boundaries. So I think the next point I make in my little ebook I've written is exactly that flexibility is great, but with it comes a potential blurring of boundaries between your work and your home life. And that can be problematic. Obviously, for those of us who are working virtually at work, we have that advantage because we're going to somewhere else to work and coming home. For those of us who are working from home, it can be quite tricky. If we have, like you said, people living with us, children or others, they might interrupt. No, I think we've all had those experiences.
We were just laughing, weren't we? Because just before we started the podcast, even though I've got a notice I put on my door saying, podcast, keep out, I can still, my daughter sings wherever she is, and it's very lovely, but it does tend to interfere with webinars and podcasts. It's
funny, isn't it? Or somebody can be using up your bandwidth, and you're like, excuse me, I knew that for my Zoom call. So I think all of those things, I think we had only touched on those issues before. And I think it's partly about expectation of the other. So often if you're in a meeting, there's a cultural shift now, isn't there? Where people previously it might have been frowned upon, or you would have felt very awkward if you had an interruption on a big business meeting. But now I think people in general are more accepting that you might get interrupted, because it might happen to them too, whether it's a pet or a child or a significant other wandering in. So I think that's one thing that can happen, is that blurring of boundaries. And I think there are ways to manage it. I mean, obviously the answer is to be clear about boundaries. Like you said, you've got your notice on the door and so on. But as you've also just pointed out, it doesn't always work. So I think it's worth having a little couple of strategies in your back pocket. So I think when it comes to interruptions, exactly that, telling people this is when I'm working. And then maybe, especially if you've got younger children, assigning another adult to be in charge, and tell it, as long as the child understands, maybe not a tiny baby, just telling the child as well, I am working now, if you need something, go to this other person. And then obviously, in the teamwork spirit of a family, you might then do the reverse for your partner when they're working. I think it is about being explicit, isn't it? And again, I think that does get right back to boundaries. I think that's one theme I think that's run through this ebook I've written, is being explicit about what you can and can't do, when you can and can't do it, is really helpful for everybody, because then it sets expectations, and then it can allow you to be productive without hopefully getting too overstretched, because you don't feel you have to be doing it all. And you touched on guilt there. Guilt is such a huge thing, isn't it? It's definitely something that we see in the work I do for these Thrive workshops and for caring professionals, that guilt that you're not doing enough at work, guilt that you're not doing enough at home. It's just everywhere you look, it's possible to feel guilty, and that's quite draining as well. It is about the labor, the work of thinking about this stuff, going through this process, being explicit, all that is basically management, isn't it? It's management planning for your workplace, except this place happens to be at home. I think some things can help, actually. Visual cues, I think, can be quite helpful for you and for those around you. So I was just saying before we started recording, I always try and put work clothes on before anything like work tasks. So this is a podcast, I think it's on YouTube as well, but I've put my work clothes on, and I've avoided that. Don't know if you've ever done the pitfall where you wear the posh top for your Zoom call, but keep your tracky bottoms on.
Yes.
And right down to like, I don't know, slippers on your feet. And I used to do that. And I think that's fine when you're working, because it can sometimes maybe even feel a luxury, like, oh, lucky me, I'm still being cozy and so forth. But the snag is when you then finish work and you're still wearing those slippers or those tracksuit bottoms, it sometimes makes it harder to signal to yourself you're off work and harder to relax. So that's definitely true for me. So I wear everything, including, I've got my posh shoes on for you, Rachel.
Have you now?
So
go on, show us.
Not see them. Oh, okay, there you go. Little,
this is obviously for the people watching on YouTube. Very nice.
Oh, there you go.
Lovely sort of snake skin pumps. Lovely,
thing.
like
very
those.
Good. Yeah. But yeah, no, only for work. So put them on. Certain mindset is adopted, and then take them off again, and you sort of can tell yourself you're not working. But it also helps for family members, because then they just see, you might say, like you said to your daughter, but then they might see you walking down the corridor and be like, oh, look, she's wearing these work shoes. Therefore, it's another cue, isn't it? Another non-verbal cue. And a lanyard is another helpful thing you might want to do for those of you who have a lanyard at work. Just put it on when you're working, take it off when you're not. And again, that helps. Or simple things like walking around the block, walking around your garden, just some activity you do at the beginning and the end of your workplace or work time. And that gets onto this third space hack, which is basically an extension of these boundary rituals. I think for a lot of us, we just talked about the challenges of the commute at the beginning, didn't we, with the cost and so on. But it did have a benefit, which we probably all might not have noticed when we were struggling in the traffic jams. That it was a third space. It wasn't work or home. So on the way to work, you might be preparing or getting your mind set for work, and on the way home, it'd allow you to unwind. And then we don't have that anymore if we're working from home. It might again happen if you're working virtually at work, but for those working at home. So again, it's about being creative about making that third space hack for yourself, whether it's changing the clothes, but I think a physical time can help, like a mini commute, hence walk around the garden or walk around the block, to signal to yourself, and again to those you live with, that the transition is now over. I'm now at work, or I'm now at home. And I think for those who who live alone, there's different challenges, aren't there? Okay, I think the boundaries are potentially more easily blurred, and I think it can feel very difficult to switch off from work. So I recommend people who live alone to try to plan some social connections outside work time. It might just be walking around the block, going to your local shop, or albeit with a face mask, you're still seeing some human beings, or setting up walks with friends, and just so that you're planning to have the social contact that might otherwise not have required planning pre-pandemic.
Yeah, I think doing that in that space that we call the third space is really helpful, isn't it? Because I talk to lots of people about this third space. I call it the decompression zone. Because what we're doing on our commute is just reflecting on what's happened in the day, resting a little bit perhaps, as long as we're not stewing in a traffic jam, and then sort of resetting our brains for what we're going to be coming into when we get home. And when it's just like, so my home life is just outside that door, and so there's not a lot of time to do that. So I have started going for a run or doing half an hour Pilates, so something that's going to demarc where I can turn my brain off. And I know lots of people go for walks or take the dog out for a walk or something. And I think if you've been working on your own and you're on your own in the evening, that is quite a good time, like you said, to make a connection and have a little debrief from the day. But we often just forget to do that, don't we? And that really, really blurs the boundaries. Also, the other problem with not having this commute is that people can't listen to podcasts.
That is very true. I now plan my podcast, but luckily there's always a fair bit of general life tidying up, and I try and do that with plan my podcast while I'm doing washing up. Try not to drop the phone in the water. Yeah, I think you do. But again, it's planning. I think that's one thing about working from home in the pandemic. It requires a lot more planning and sometimes some more creativity to basically emulate things that might have happened naturally when we weren't working from home.
There's a really good TED talk about this, and we'll post the link to the TED talk. I think it's with Adam Fraser, talking about the third space, saying that some people do some mindfulness, or some people like completely, like you said, change their clothes or have a shower, or it's putting in some rituals actually. Another thing, if I'm not going for a run or something, is just sitting and having a cup of tea with my other half and just having a chat. So something to signal the day is gone. But then the really important thing is to leave one's phone and leave one's laptop away, because sometimes I go to the kitchen and find him sat on his laptop and his phone. I'm like, no, this is end of the day stuff, stop working. But we do just think, oh well, I'm here anyway, I might as well just finish off that email or just do that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we've got again, pre-pandemic, we got a very nice, it's actually a wooden, basically it's just a laptop stand that we put in the kitchen, but it's next to the table on the floor, and it has some lovely carpenter has written on it something, no technology at the table, and it's basically a place to put everything, laptops, phones. And so again, people do bring them to the table and you're like, no, put it here. It's made of wood. It somehow resonates with the fact that we're putting things away from the table and they're in a wooden, not a metal stand. And that again is a visual cue. I find that quite helpful for us as a family, just to be like, nope, into the stand, and then obviously try and promote us all doing the same thing together, like you said, so we're all having downtime.
So the other thing about working from home is the physical aspect of it, and the aspect that we're just not moving around like we used to do. So what sort of hacks do you have for that?
That's interesting, isn't it? I just have started using my trusty Fitbit. Other tracking devices are available. And that really came home to me. I've actually only recently started using it, but it is really evident when you have some activity tracker how much of the time you're sedentary. So I think there's a few things about that, actually. The first is obviously move more. It's pretty simple to say, but I think it's like, how do you do that? So I think there's simple, obvious things like we've already said, like walk around the block. You might want to have a run. You might want to build in a yoga online on your lunch break. So you can do all that, and that's really important. But I think there's some other evidence about how you move in, just to build it into your day more. So if you imagine, for example, you're a GP or hospital doctor, you would have been up and down out of your chair, calling every patient in. That's quite a lot of getting up and down, which you wouldn't naturally do otherwise. So there's lots of things you can do. You could set timers or reminders just to get out of your chair. You could do something called desk exercise. Rachel and I have done this before, where you do a few literally just sitting or standing at your desk exercises. So the idea is it doesn't take away a huge amount of time from your work, but it's still getting your body moving. There's standing desks. We're both standing at the moment. Or just standing up. I actually don't have a standing desk, but when I need to get one, but when I'm doing something like this, which is a podcast, I actually don't need to sit. I can stand up and talk to you. So I think just being a little bit creative and even having those thoughts cross your mind is helpful. And then there's also some evidence about how we sit. There's some really interesting evidence about the type of sitting. So sitting in a chair is the most restful posture. So if you were to sit in a different way, for example, you might want to kneel or squat. Again, you might be able to do that. For example, that's where a laptop might be helpful. Put your laptop on a coffee table and just for half an hour kneel at the laptop and work on it. Those things will use up more muscles, or not use up more muscles. They take more muscle tone to sustain those postures. And that in itself is going to help your metabolic rate. So I think those things are helpful. And also small things, like you might want to do, I don't know, 8 minutes of Joe Wicks or a quick bit of HIIT, literally a few minutes of activity rather than a whole half hour.
Actually, one good one, and I'll post it in the link. There's a chap called the Fitness Marshal. Have you come across him?
No.
Oh, he's hilarious. Does dance routines. So he's got a 4-minute dance routine to Poker Face by Lady Gaga, which often I make people in the breaks when we're doing the Shapes Toolkit, I get people to turn off the cameras, go for a 10-minute break, but do this dance on their own. It's really funny, but it gets you moving and it just makes you feel so much better. It's only 4 minutes. Yeah. So you don't even break a sweat doing it. It's quite nice.
Yeah, so I think those things, exactly that. So again, like you said, having a child who's singing is sometimes a great thing. They'll get you remembering, have a sing and a dance around the kitchen. Yeah, that if you're working from home, you get that opportunity.
Well, they'll be singing, and then as soon as I start dancing, they'll just cringe with embarrassment and just say, "Oh, Mum, that's just so awful. You're dancing."
You're like, that is what we're here for. We're here to embarrass you. That's what parents are for. So there's a few thoughts there about that. And I also think when it comes to actual sitting, there's sort of ways to think about that as well. At the very beginning, we all grabbed a laptop and sat on the sofa initially. But I think, I don't know about you, there was definitely, you get more aches and pains there, don't you? Sort of neck ache, eye strain, and again, wrist strain, because actually the positioning of your wrist on a laptop isn't ideal. So I think this happened to me in the first lockdown because it was summertime then. How you sit and where you sit matters. So I then started thinking about my posture, and I'm pretty short. So I just had a proper sit down and think, basically that it's the rule of 90 degrees. Every joint needs to kind of be 90 degrees, ankle, knee, hip, shoulders, elbows. And if you can try and sit in that way and then find a desk and chair setup that fits that is really helpful. The Health and Safety Executive have got a page on there called DSE. So Health and Safety Executive website, display screen equipment, that's what the DSE stands for. It's got a whole page and it's got a little video which just really simply maps out what I've just described. It's sometimes helpful to have someone else look at you as well, because you might think you're sitting kind of roughly square on, but you might not be. And again, if you're going to be doing it for a long time, it's worth taking a few minutes to set it up. And then if you find, as I did, that actually I wasn't sitting in that posture, you don't need to you can buy some fancy kit, but you can just get a box. So I've got a cutlery box, it's about that big, she says, for those of you on YouTube. And it's just the right size for my short legs. So that sits under my desk and it's the perfect footstool. So really simple stuff doesn't have to cost any money sometimes. Also, there's stuff about the physical environment. Again, just like I said, in the summer, I was downstairs in the kitchen. It was very bright and airy, but actually bright and airy translates to quite a lot of glare when you're working at your screen, and it can be quite hot. And again, a few minutes, no big deal. But, days and weeks, you can get headaches and glare-related issues. So again, it's not rocket science, but worth getting a shade, a blind, trying to adjust your screen so you're not getting glare. Those with varifocals, it's quite common for people just to tip their chin back a bit in order to read a screen. Because if you think about a varifocal spectacle, the top half of the lens is for distance, the bottom half is for reading. There's actually only a very small part of that lens, which is for a computer screen, which is not at reading distance, it's not at far distance. So then you might accommodate for that by chipping your tin back. Again, not a big deal for a few minutes, but do it over weeks and months. You can get quite a lot of strain or headaches.
So can you get glasses that are specifically for screens?
You need to go to your optician and have it. So it's just normal. Again, none of this is rocket science, but you just have to think about it and realize that's the cause, rather than wondering why you're getting a sore neck. You can go to opticians, do an eye check, tell them what you're doing and how you're working, and you can get they're called, I think you can get fixed distance glasses for screens, but you can also get occupational varifocals. So instead of being at the top half of your lens being distance and the bottom being reading distance, I think the bottom part is reading distance and the top half is computer distance. It's designed for those two activities you do while working in an office. There's all possible, but you just need to do that planning piece and getting it sorted. But again, simple stuff, but really, really helpful, because otherwise what can happen is quite significant migraines, serious back problems, and over time they can be quite distracting and affect your productivity and your well-being, which we've obviously been talking about. So I think all of that stuff is worth just thinking about, and I think sometimes you need to step back and reflect. How am I doing this? What is the process I'm using for my work? And thinking of it in those terms rather than just, again, jumping on the sofa with a laptop.
So there's movement breaks, there's making sure your setup is properly okay. And then I noticed one of your hacks is also taking breaks.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I love taking a break. But I think, breaks are important, aren't they? Because I think there's a lot of evidence they really help productivity. And they've done some really interesting studies with surgeons where they had two surgeons do the same surgery. One took no break, one made the patient safe, and midway through surgery took a short break, didn't step away from the patient, but just literally took a break and looked out the window essentially for a minute or two. And the operations were the same length, which shows that the function or the performance of the surgeon who took the break was better after the break, which I think might help people feel a bit less guilty, because I think guilt is a factor, quite a big factor. I think when we are working from home in particular, we feel that we can't take a break, we need to demonstrate we're working because there's no one actually physically seeing us. So talk about that when talk a bit more about workplace trust.
So interesting with breaks, I also read something about the fact that they looked at parole board judges in the US, and they looked at how lenient they were with prisoners coming up on parole, and whether it was related to the nature of the prisoner's crimes, any unconscious biases that they had, anything like that. And they found that the one thing that decided if a judge was going to be lenient with someone and let them out of prison or put them back in prison for another 9 months or so was the time that had elapsed between the nearest snack.
Yeah.
So how long had they had some sugar? And if they had had a snack in very recently, they were really lenient. And if they were hungry, they were horrible.
Yeah,
and it just made me think, oh, hang on a sec. What does that mean for me when I'm with my kids or people with patients, or, really makes a difference, doesn't it?
Makes a massive difference. I think that's really interesting, isn't it? I've actually started using the Pomodoro technique, which you probably know about, where you have your 4 30 or 25-minute breaks with a 5-minute break in between, and then at the end of that 4 you have a longer break. And that makes a massive difference to me, because again, it's a discipline, makes you take that break at the end of half hour. I actually have for those on YouTube, stand timer, because I thought I'm a bit too classy for a Pomodoro. For those who don't know, Pomodoro,
that's
I think, is
25-minute timer of that.
It's a 25-minute timer, yeah. And the Pomodoro technique was using a tomato-shaped kitchen timer from, I think it was an Italian university students just sort of worked it out in the couple of years ago. But I thought, I'm going to go for an egg time, sand timer, not a kitchen timer. But I look for one for exactly that time, 25 minutes, and then it finishes, and it gives you a visual cue as you work through your time, how much more time until the next break, which I think is a motivational thing as well. Yeah. And then it helps you work on your productivity it's quite helpful to plan how many Pomodoros, how many 30-minute spans of time you think your task will take, and then how long it actually did take, which then can aid future planning and productivity. So I think there's quite a lot of ways you can use breaks in planning and segments to help.
I think that Pomodoro technique, they did work out, didn't they, that 25 minutes was the optimal time to concentrate until you just need to switch your brain off. And there is good reason to switch your brain off. In fact, I learned this from a book that got sent out from my son's school about how to learn. It said, kids, when you're learning, your brain is in focus mode. You're really concentrating, linear brainwaves. But when you take a break, you start wandering around and your brain flips over to diffuse mode. Your brain waves are crossing both cerebral hemispheres, and you're solving problems and you're being creative. Yeah. So if you want to be creative and solve problems and be more productive, you've got to take those breaks to put your brain into that diffuse mode.
It's interesting.
That's something I never learned about at medical school, I tell you.
That's very true. No, it's interesting. And I wonder about that. There's something I read about, if you're on a break, don't use your phone. So you literally need to be switching off from that focus mode. So no screens at all on your break. And even some evidence that just looking out the window, assuming you're looking at something natural versus other sort of concrete buildings, that can be beneficial, again, for that same reason, that it's encouraging you to look in a different way and perceive data in a different way. Really interesting stuff. And one of your previous podcasts had a really lovely talk about how when you take your exercise, you can grow, is it brain growth factor?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was like, that's another reason to take a break.
You sprout your dendrites when you do that and you take some exercise. Yeah.
Another reason just to help your cognition by taking a break. Really interesting stuff, actually. And they did something in 2014. The WHO did a paper on the social determinants of health. It's quite a big paper, but there's a small nugget in there about having a pot plant in your office was beneficial. So again, nature's beneficial, but even if you can't get to nature, just having a pot plant, looking at the pot plant on your break, watering the pot plant, whatever it is, that is linked to, I think it was improved mood and improved performance in office workers. It's really simple things to do on your breaks that are not screen related.
So I've got a pot plant in the corner. Will that count?
Yes, I've got a pot plant here.
Well, my plant count, even though it's fake.
I don't know the answer. I've got a succulent because I had normal plants and I forgot to water them and then they died. That's
Get a fake one. No one will ever know, apart from if you talk about it on your podcast.
I didn't know. Yeah, you've blown your cover there.
I have blown it. Sorry, everyone, but I like my fern.
It's very nice. Yeah, it looks quite healthy.
It's really healthy.
So I did something with a live one and then it died, which isn't good. So instead of fake,
I kill plants. I'm really bad, but I love looking at them. So hence, if anyone's got any good false fake plant websites, please send them to me because I'm always on the lookout. So
I would recommend a succulent for that reason, because
Okay, they're quite difficult to kill, aren't they?
They're very difficult to kill. Yeah.
So, right, I'm going to get myself succulent, put it on my windowsill over there so I can see it. So we haven't got huge amounts of time left, but I did want to just touch on your last couple of tips for working well from home. And these are, I think, interlinked really, about connecting with people and trust within the workplace. I know we've already talked about the importance, you know, particularly if you're living on your own, but, you know, why is connecting so important?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Again, pre-pandemic, it was something that we might have had to think sort of would have seen odd, but now I think we all know, at least intuitively, that we do need to connect socially because we've all struggled with lack of connection. But I think at work, I think it's important to remember that at work you're dealing with other human beings too, so it's about trying to foster that human side of the connection. So you might be having Zoom calls, emailing your colleagues, and maybe more of that than hitherto, but I think it's about remembering the human side, because like we said about the emotional labor, I think workplace relationships require building and fostering and nurturing. That's how teams grow and develop and thrive. So you need to think about those non-work contacts. They don't have to take a lot of time, but you may be just allowing a bit of non-work chat at the beginning of a Zoom call, maybe having some Zoom work drinks, you know, so some connections that work related that are not about completing tasks. So an away day or a Christmas drinks would have been an example, but it's about doing those things virtually. And also screens, I think, as we just said, take up a lot of cognitive, it takes up a lot of your brain space to look at a screen. So I think allowing people to look away from the screen and not being offended if that happens, maybe just using an old-fashioned phone, because I think sometimes we're more familiar, it can actually feel a bit more intimate. You listen to people's tone of voice, and I think you might connect better. Maybe a walk and talk phone call, maybe for a brainstorming meeting when you both put your headphones in and walk about. And then, maybe for some types of work and definitely for non-work relationships, like posts, send people something actually physical they can touch and handle, which is helpful, or a thank you card and bits like that. So I think those things are quite helpful, and we need to build that in. And now we're kind of allowed to go for a walk, isn't it? A walk with one person and so forth. You know, trying to build that in. It can be a work colleague as well. You could do that, have some exercise together. Just trying again to be creative, to build and foster those human connections, because they are really the glue that sticks the workplace together.
I'm such a big fan of the get on the phone and walk and talk. So, you know, get a decent pair of headphones for your phone and I completely agree. And I have read an article recently about the fact that we are so much more empathic on the phone than we are on a virtual thing. That was really interesting to me, because you'd think you can still hear people's tones of voice on video, but because you're looking at them as well. But the problem is the cues you're getting, they're not the same, because 2D is never the same. You're not, you know, I'm now looking at you. I'm not looking at you. I'm looking at my camera.
Yeah.
And it feels like you're looking at you, but most people look at you, and now it feels like I'm not looking, and you look a bit disengaged and all that sort of stuff.
That's really interesting. That's right. Of course. Yeah. I think that might be a large part of it, actually. Yeah. And I think we're more familiar, aren't we? We've been on the phone for years and years. So I think we're a bit better at it. We're a bit better at listening to the cues and so on. And I think you do pay more attention to tone of voice when you don't have the vision included. And I think it's even worse if you're on a meeting, so you've got lots of little squares of people. It's very difficult to connect with all of those people. I think one-on-one it's easier. So I think those are all quite important factors, I think. And then those feed into the last point about trust, isn't it? So I think we touched on this before. I think there's a bit of, I think maybe from both sides, if you're this is maybe less if you're self-employed, more if you have a manager, but you might feel you have to prove you're working because they're not there witnessing you. So you might, I need to send that email at 11 p.m. to prove I'm working so hard. But usually that just is essentially a form of presenteeism when you're at work but you're not being very productive. It's probably better for everybody if you just take the breaks we talked about and then be productive in your work hours and then take a proper break. But the thing that hinges on is trust, you know. So from both, but it's a two-way thing between you and your manager, and it's about setting expectations, being clear, as we've said, and explicit. But there is I think it needs to be understood on both sides that working from home is not the same as working at work. You won't be available in the same way. People literally can't walk down the corridor and open your door when you're there. They have to call you. You might not answer. There's maybe a bit more planning for meetings. And that's just the way it is at the moment. So I think it's about understanding and accepting and working together on those things. And I've noticed that relationships that started pre-pandemic, so teams that were formed and worked together in quote real life, I think some of them found it easier to transition to home working, and tech companies and so on were doing this a lot anyway. People who've started a new role in lockdown and started working with colleagues who they have never met, or they might only see on Zoom, or some people, you know, they might only hear them on the phone and never see their face. I think those relationships are harder to build, and teams are harder to build. And again, gets back to the previous point, trying to build that connection to offset those challenges.
Yeah, that is really tricky, and I've certainly got quite a few people that I've been working with who have started in their roles during the pandemic, so have never met people face to face.
Yeah,
and it's something we talk about a lot in my Resilient Team Academy. It's about how do you have these informal connections, because you've got to make them formal, because you've got to arrange a time to have them. So whereas before you'd just be wandering about by the coffee machine or the water dispenser, and you'd be able to just go, oh hi, how are you, and you'd solve a problem. How do you actually schedule those in? And I know quite a few people are slightly allergic to the virtual coffee break because it's a bit awkward, right? And you get on and no one knows what to say. But I always say to people, firstly, don't try and do it in a massive group, because small talk, a big group is really hard. Do it in like 2s or 3s or even 4s max. And then secondly, give yourself something to talk about. So say, right, we're going to talk about, right, what's your biggest challenge? What's your biggest challenge? Make it useful, solve a problem together, and you automatically get over this, what do I talk about? You then get over it's a waste of my time doing it. And actually it becomes really, really helpful. So I think we need to get a little bit more creative about what we're actually doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a tech company who used to do this, and I think that's been adopted more broadly. Exactly that. They actually would set up, I think they got people out of a hat. So these people who are working virtually anyway, pre-pandemic, and they'd pull names out of a hat, set them to pairs of people who never met each other before into a virtual Zoom room. And just, I think they had to talk about a hobby or something unwork related. And then that was it. That was the whole task. But those things gradually end up being glue, because then I don't know, Bob and Jane have a meeting, and then later on they actually have a work meeting, then they're like, oh, I remember you love skiing. And, you know, it's all those small things, like you said, that would have naturally arisen. And it's about trying to plan them without it feeling too awkward, but they still kind of need to be done, don't they? Because they are the glue that sticks it together.
There's a lovely podcast called Work Life with Adam Grant, and it's fantastic. And they were talking about how you build up connections in the workplace. And the one thing they realised, really, they basically got a load of strangers, put them into 2s and said, right, your task in 3 minutes is to make a deep connection, or maybe more than 3 minutes. And they looked at what they talked about, and actually what they really tried, you know, what book has influenced you the most in the last year, you know, what significant thing has happened to you. That worked really nicely. But then they said to these pairs of strangers, I now want you to give each other feedback on how that was for you. Yeah. And they'd be going, oh, well, I was initially a bit awkward, but then it was quite good. And I thought, well, we could connect on this. And it was that self-disclosure of giving the feedback that really formed the deep connection. Yeah. And they came out with this fact, it only takes apparently 40 seconds to make a deep connection with someone.
Gosh.
That's brilliant. So it actually doesn't take too long, but if there's a bit of self-disclosure, and the other thing was finding uncommon commonality, like, oh, we both love making model boats. Yeah. Or we both love something. Let's find something that's common to us that isn't to anyone else. That really does help. So I think it's just knowing that can be really helpful.
That is interesting, isn't it? And again, it's about willingness on part of both people to be a little bit vulnerable. I mean, essentially, that's what it is, isn't it? That's what connection is. It's about being authentic, but you need to be willing. And if there's a barrier like a screen, then I think you need to just be a little bit more willing to overcome those barriers than you might be around, like you said, around the coffee machine.
Yeah, willing and creative. And don't forget that, you know, work drinks late in the evening is not going to suit a lot of people. Yeah. And exactly. What can you do? And if possible, do a task together that forges connections quicker than anything else. So
playing games, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, really important. So Katya, we've covered an awful lot there. If you wanted to give people sort of 3 main take-home messages about how to work virtually really well, what would they be?
Golly, 3 top tips. Yeah. I think boundaries are really important, and all the different things we've discussed about boundaries. I think moving is really important, because within that, of course, it falls the topic of breaks as well. So think about your boundaries, think about how you're going to move. And then I think the third thing is one of my favorites, which is about permission, giving yourself permission to look after yourself, giving yourself permission to think about these and implement these things, giving yourself permission to have the break, do the movement, speak to your boss about what's realistic. I think, again, as in so many things, if you don't give yourself permission, you can't access all these other strategies. You've got to notice how you're doing. give yourself permission to do what works for you, knowing that it's going to benefit you and those around you. I think those would be my three.
So for me, out of all of that, it's that planning piece. It's, you can't just sit down and work from home and expect it to happen really well. You've got to think about, what do I need? What's going to work for me physically? What's going to work for me emotionally? What's going to work for the team? And what changes do I need to make it work? And it may be spending a little bit of money on a decent pair of glasses, or a standing desk, or some equipment that you need, or a subscription to some sort of gym app that means you can do it. I don't know, but what is it? And a bit of investment in yourself, really important.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think you're right. It's about, again and again, permission to do that, looking after yourself, investing in yourself, because knowing it will be all right for the benefit, it'll help others as well as yourself. Definitely.
Katya, thank you so much. That's been really super helpful. If people wanted to contact you, how can they find you?
Oh yes, website workingwelldoctor.com. If you would like this ebook, there is actually a tab on the top which says free ebook, so you could go to the website and sort of click on the link to get that. My email, theworkingwellexperience@gmail.com, just for anything. And I hang out on social media, as they say. So I'm on Instagram at working_well_doctor. I think I'm Katya Miles Working Well on Facebook, and I'm on LinkedIn. It'd be lovely to see you guys anywhere, any of those places.
Great. Thank you so much, Katya. And we'll have to get you back another time because there's loads more we can talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be good fun.
Brilliant. See you soon.
See you.
Bye. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please share it with your friends and colleagues. Please subscribe to my You Are Not a Frog email list and subscribe to the podcast. And if you have enjoyed it, then please leave me a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. So keep well, everyone. You're doing a great job. You got this.